Well, thanks to Marcy for inviting me out. And it was on short notice. It was, I think, on Tuesday that she invited me to come out. But it is something that I feel is incredibly important, this initiative to start a research network amongst the various... where are we going? Amongst the various landscape programs in the country. Every profession needs to have research: medicine, law, engineering, even architecture. But landscape architecture, I would say, has had a relative dearth of research, of really serious research. I think some of the talks today really were very encouraging, I think. You know, the work that Keith is doing and others that presented today really is some of the best work I've seen in a very long time, and is founded in some real rigor. And I think that is what we need. So my perspective on this talk is not like anybody else's, I don't think. And I'm taking some of the discussions that we had yesterday amongst the smaller group to heart, and really looking at what is it that you're really trying to do here. I'm not going to really talk about every kind of research that you could get into, because landscape is a huge subject. As I said yesterday, my mother doesn't know what I do, and I'm hearing the same discussions 30 years later. Things have improved in many respects, but we're still having the same discussions about how landscape architects can be relevant, and what is it that they do, and why don't people understand what we do, and why we seem to be marginalized. The only way I believe that we will be recognized is through example. And so many years ago, I made a very conscious decision to go into practice as opposed to academia, and the reason was a couple of reasons. I found in some schools that I would find people being so protectorate of the most banal work and ideas that they have, that I found it quite offensive. It was as if they thought they'd never have another idea, so they couldn't give it away. So this idea of dissemination, both from practitioners as well as from research, is our professional responsibility. We have creative minds, we know how to use them, and we need to be able to get our ideas out to others, and we should freely give of them. Because there's a lot to do. So I asked, and now this is, I wrote a mission statement for your institute, and this is completely on me. The ideas I'm putting forward here are right. But I thought that you need to have, what are you trying to really do with this research network? And I know people have talked about their research interests, and the breadth of their research is formidable, and it's interesting. But a research network has a purpose, and I believe that purpose is to promote collaboration and research within and between Canada's landscape architecture departments to address important landscape-related issues facing the country. I should add also the profession. And because the profession has to be intimately engaged in this process if it's going to be successful. So why are we doing it? Like, what kinds of questions are we trying to ask? Well, I think there's a number of them, and I'm going to go through them. But first of all, we have to know what's happening. How are landscapes changing? Why are they changing? What are the stressors, the drivers of change? What are the impacts? On what values? At what scales? On whom? And what can we do about it? These are, pretty high-level ideas, but I know, I was interesting Alan's comment on how many people are just doing research because it's just of interest to them. That's fine. I'm more power to you. Go ahead. I feel, though, that there are some big issues that we have to deal with. Climate change, urbanization, linear infrastructure, agriculture, forestry, mining. Almost everything on the planet changes for one of those areas. I suppose you could add fishing into it as well, and there's others, but most of it. If you look after these things, I think we'll be in pretty good shape. So just going through it, and again, I was just listening to people and our own interests as a firm. I have a 40-person landscape architecture and planning firm, and the kinds of things that we get involved in, and we do research. I believe our projects are research. I believe our projects, in a sense, are our publications. We should probably publish more in the more traditional sense to get it out there, but we're busy. So in terms of climate change, which I would say, yeah, it's right up there. I'm going to give you a bunch of topic areas. There's two that I think are absolutely critical. Not that the others aren't important, but two are absolutely critical because they capture so much. And one of them is climate change, obviously. How can landscape be designed to adapt to climate change and leverage multiple benefits? And again, it's where landscape architects, I believe, have the ability to leverage those collateral benefits to recreation, to ecology, and so on. When engineers are going to come in and they're going to spend $30 million along the Bow River in Calgary, for instance. Well, that's a lot of money. How many parks departments do you know have $30 million to step up to a public realm improvement without being able to get on the back of an engineering project? So I think this is critical, and I think it's also, we need to be able to talk about how landscape is green infrastructure, and it has to have the cachet that a pipe does. Not that a pipe's sexy, but if a deep sewer doesn't work, you can bet that people get upset about it. So we have to have people understanding that there is real economic value in our infrastructure. So protecting against flooding is the big one, I guess, and whether it's coastal flooding and inundation or it's riverine flooding, and so on, which I'm more familiar with. Also as stormwater treatment infrastructure. Agroforestry happens to be a pet research area of mine, and I believe that landscape architects understanding temperate agroforestry will be able to ameliorate the effects of climate change on the prairies, for instance, with wind and desiccation and so on. You've heard of windbreaks. We used to do windbreaks on the prairies. We don't anymore. We will again. How can landscapes be fire-smarted? How can we protect communities? You're all, you in BC particularly, and we've had one or two in Alberta in the last few years, it's a serious issue. We're going to burn the place down. In the turn of the century, between about turn of the last century, about 1890 and 1915 or 20, 85% of the eastern slopes of the Rockies burned. It's a big bang landscape. And there's a number of reasons for that, but it happens. And it happens right across the planet. We should be shaping those things. I mean, we're just going to let a bunch of forest technicians, I started off as a forest technician and a forest ranger, are we going to let them go out and grab their chainsaws and do the job without consulting us how it might affect the public open spaces that communities have access to? And how can we plan for biodiversity in changing landscapes? Now, these are deep topics, and we could talk about any one of them for hours. But For instance, one of the people in our office, PhD, did his PhD research on designing protected networks, conservation networks under climate change. How well is our current system going to stand up to climate change? Well, it'll get about 70% of what it was designed to do under climate change. So we're going to have to reimagine how we plan for our protected networks. So just as an example of projects, this is a project, this part of it is now mostly complete. This is about several kilometers of along the south shore of the Bow surrounding Calgary. So you have, downtown Calgary, all this area flooded, $8 billion worth of damage. At the time, it was the most costly natural disaster in Canadian history. So those kinds of impacts tend to focus the mind, and I think that's why the work that Keith and Hope and others are doing is so important in the realm of climate change. So we had a big event here, and it was so-called in around the 100-year event, except that it was a 300-year event that hit High River to the south, which we also ended up doing the redevelopment of the whole town, basically, because it was just wiped out, High River. There's a clue in the name, perhaps, but it was 300 millimeters in one day fell just upstream of High River. My own home flooded out in this event. I'm a land use planner. I live in the flood fringe. Lovely, nice spot though. But the foresight was that there was some older knowledge there. The fellow who developed all the old houses in our areas, his own house that he developed, which we live in, he put up a little bit higher. So just the basement flooded. So there's flood protection going to go in all the way along here, all the way down to Riverwalk. And those of you who are familiar with Riverwalk in Calgary knows it was just built a few years ago. Unfortunately, they built it 1.5 meters too low. So it's going to be redone, and you can imagine how that goes over. But this project then took this section from the Peace Bridge and our Delta Garden here. Let me see if I can. No. Try that again. There we go. This section around the Peace Bridge is a big Delta Garden. It's all elevated. And then we have I guess I better stop doing that. We have a long promenade that runs right down to Eau Claire Plaza, and then we'll continue that all the way along. It's a flood wall, actually, and it's kind of simple. It's not as sophisticated as some of the flood control stuff you're talking about. So it's a flood wall, but we wrapped it in this quite a nice bench that's a 100-meter long bench, and there's literally thousands of people on that right now. So that whole public realm was vastly improved, basically because we had to do a flood project. But there's been recognition now that we can't just turn engineers loose. As much as I like to work with engineers, I prefer to work with engineers than some other professions because they know what they don't know generally, and they know how to work collaboratively. So that's a gross generalization, but I think that working with engineers from concept, from initial ideas, is one way that we collaborate, and I think successfully. So there's a whole bunch of different strategies we have for armoring the edge, for raising the grades, for putting in walls, and so on, to allow for this area to be a pleasant urban space. And by all accounts, people seem to like it. Another example, at a slightly different process, is treating stormwater well, quite a bit different process. It's actually treating stormwater. It's not so much trying to stop the big event. This area will be wiped in a big event, but we've tried to create a park that would have a whole series of wetland treatment areas, starting from kind of a very innovative something called the Nautilus Pond that Bernie Emile and an engineer designed and came up with, to then this whole system of wetlands and filtration areas and polishing areas that we designed, and together with engineers. But we gave it some real design features. So it actually it's treating stormwater, frequent stormwater events, like the 2 to 5 year event will go through here, and smaller stuff as well before it gets to the Bow River. So it's all polished in here, protecting water from it's a drainage area of about 25,000 hectares. But it's now open, and it's pretty cool. It looks as good as we thought it would, and so it's exciting stuff actually to get into something that's a machine, but it's got all these other kinds of importance to it. Then across from here, so this is just an air photo off of Google. So it's a big project, right? That's a big area. Then we're building a berm. All this area flooded. This area in here, all this area flooded. The whole works right over to here. In fact, it shut off the railways and everything. All this flooded. But so we're going to build, or the city wants to build, basically a berm along there, a dike, a levee along the edge. Typical. But and you can imagine that the people who have the $1 million views along the edge are not too keen on that, and so there's you almost have to have security when you go to a public engagement on it. Well, you do actually, but they've involved us now because they know that we can work with the engineers to add value to the individual landowner's property as well. We can start to create spaces in their individual yards, all 95 of them or however many there are, and so we're meeting with them, understanding what their issues are, where their views are really important, how they're using their backyard. I mean, we don't usually do residential design, but this allows us to put in an important flood protection area. This is another area along the Bow. We're doing a ton of work, like several major parks all the way along the Bow. But this was an area downstream of an irrigation weir, and the irrigation weir was redirected to allow for a kayak passage through it. So over here, you can see the real kayak passage. There's other areas that's tougher to go through here and so on. It's become a water playground, and we've worked very closely with Clone Crippen engineers on this to design the kind of all the public areas along the edge, and it's super engineered, as you would imagine. It's not perhaps the detail you might like as in some situations, but it works and people love it. It's just the most amazing water playground right in the center of the city now, just opened. Or you get down into LID, low impact development, finer scale kinds of work that we do. But I want to talk a little bit about geodesign, because I think that, so that's, I would call all that stuff related to land and water, climate change, and so on. I would dump them all in together almost, because we have to deal with land and water in an integrated manner, whether it's facing challenges like sea level rise or increased big events. So I would dump all that into one area of a category of research, and I would say it's probably number one. The second area that I think is critical is urban growth management, and that applies everywhere in the world, let alone here. And an approach and a tools set that we've been using is geodesign. I'm sure many of you have heard of geodesign, but geodesign is where you're taking GIS and other kinds of models, not always spatial models, and you're tightly coupling that with the design process. So it's not like doing an impact assessment or running a model on a design after the fact. You're using it in a recursive, iterative way to come up with more responsive designs that clearly have performance associated with them. It's not just your opinion, it's a number wherever possible, wherever possible. I know people don't like that. I do like that. I like numbers. I like to be able to, at least for some things are critical. How much water can it take? Are you going to flood the area? So we use this set of models where we look and we try to understand what are the values resident in the landscape according to stakeholders, rights holders, and others. We assemble that data. We build a set of models to see how well the existing landscape's doing. We have a performance dashboard in our GIS environment. Some of it is real time, some of it is days time because of the complexity of the model. And then we get into a series of designs. And we're running those performance assessments on the designs as we go. And then you get into, so you probably keep it mostly in 2D to begin with, and then we move it into 3D. And it's a interactive, pressure-sensitive tablets and all that. That's the technology of it. Not so important because that's rapidly changing. But the idea that we would use performance metrics that are determined, like for instance, how do we measure plan A versus plan B? How do we know it's better besides your opinion? So that wherever we can, we're looking at those kinds of models. And so we use this approach in the plan for the regional plan for Saskatoon. And this is this whole urbanization growth management approach. So I think this is an area, well, in China alone, isn't it? Something like 600 cities, greater than 250,000 will be created in the next 10 years. So urbanization, I may be wrong, but I don't think so. Urbanization is one of the most pressing problems or issues that we have, opportunities. But we need to get it right. And so how do we look at the city region? Because I believe the city region is the most important planning scale that we have right now. There's others, of course, but that one, there's some really big impacts happening there. And it's at that scale that we need to think about landscape processes, including water. So these are what we put together for Saskatoon, and it actually got accepted, which was astounding. I was just amazed. And it's really the only really interesting thing about the plan, frankly. The rest of it is probably going to be wall-to-wall direct development. But where they're not developing is this whole green network. And the reason that we chose that is because of modeling that we did. Now this represents a 300 mil event over 24 hours. This is a fill and spill model, to those of you who are into that kind of stuff. Basically, it's an internally drained pothole landscape, and with some old river channels of the North Saskatchewan. So, and it just fills up. Well, this area, Warman, Martinsville, and all in between, of course, they wanted to build there. Well, they'd be idiots to build there. And they actually agreed that they shouldn't build there. And so that we're trying to say that this provides the potential for an open space network that has multiple benefits: water resource or stormwater management, recreation trails right into the heart of the city, part of the Wascana Center, tons of biodiversity. The most important First Nations or Indigenous site in the prairies outside of perhaps the Forks, and that is out here. It's amazing. It's quite an interesting area. But this shows modeling that then led us to, okay, now that's simple land use, but the green is really all I care about in this plan, to be truthful. And the rest of it is, densities. We did what we could with given where they had come from. These are 5 municipalities who hated each other at the beginning of the process, and they trusted each other at the end and signed up collectively for this on a volunteer basis. So anyway, I like that one. Linear infrastructure. So I'm going through the thing, right? I said climate change because of all the things it changes. Urban growth management and urbanization, and linear infrastructure. This is a project, this is a sour gas pipeline through Kananaskis country. So you can imagine that it was not at all controversial. And I'm not an apologist for the energy business, but I do believe that they can do it better than they have been in the past, and in many cases they do a very good job of it. So we won this. It was heavily appealed. It was basically, it went to court. It isn't court, it's the energy regulator, which is a quasi-judicial body, but it is like court. You stand up, you swear you're going to tell the truth, and you're questioned as an expert witness. You have to have data, and this is a landscape issue. So we had a number of wildlife models, fragmentation models, visual assessment models, all kinds of impact assessment that we used to root this. And then we built a model that was like, you can actually see on this sheep trails when we drop snow on it. It's just LiDAR. I mean, it's trivial to do in a sense now, but and then movies of it so that we could communicate to people. We could show people where the impacts were from their ranch house, et cetera, et cetera. Agriculture, the way that, how can landscape architects be involved in the planning of agricultural and agroforestry landscapes? Agroforestry being the combination of woody perennials with annual crops. Basically. Trees and shrubs, windbreaks, grow your own fertilizer, nitrogen fixing, all kinds of stuff. It's erosion control, multiple benefits. One of the most important set of technologies on the planet right now, certainly to deal with farmer livelihoods and erosion and soil degradation. I did research in that. And out of that, we also have the ability to, how do we characterize vernacular knowledge? I talked about that a little bit in the Indigenous section, which I'm going to gloss over because it was so adequately handled before, but there's technology at this scale that can be applied so that we can understand what's working. It's mostly remote sensing technology that can be applied to assessing how well agricultural landscapes are performing and how much local farmers are doing it right already. And in many cases they are. And so it isn't about us as designers, it's about us collaborating with others. Forestry. Did you know that in Alberta now, if you want to do landscape analysis, you have to be a registered professional forester. If you want to do landscape analysis in forest landscape, I can't do that, right? I know more about it than most people do, I think, in terms of forest landscape ecological assessment of forest. But I cannot do that now because we have not made the case that we know what we're doing in that field. Foresters have. They have a body of research. And so that's, again, bringing it back. I think we should be involved in certain aspects of forestry, forest landscape, recognizing that it's a collaborative field. It's collaborative with foresters, with forest hydrologists, ecologists, and others, but we have a really strong and important role to play in that, and it's not just about visuals, although that's really important too. So that's a collaborative endeavor. Well, so are all of these, actually. The next one is mining. Okay, so we're, again, oil sands. You say what you like about the oil sands. I would rather get involved in how that terrain is reclaimed and shaped than have somebody else just knock it off. Because when we do get involved, we find things like, oh, well, let's visualize this. Then, in fact, you've got water flowing uphill, or you've got a stream over here, and your design terrain surrounding it, 50 meters away, is 50 meters down. It's just people don't always see and visualize what their own designs are. I think we can help with that. There's a number of things we can do in mining. And so these are the big ticket items in terms of the vectors of change or the stressors of change. Indigenous matters, I think, was talked about far better than I ever could this morning. So I'm going to leave that alone, but I thought that the points that were made by both the speakers were really, really important. But I think there's a way that it's, they talked about mapping and so on, because that's of interest to me. I love maps, and I find that it's really valuable. And if you're going to get in a conversation on a treaty claim or a counterclaim, or you're going to court, the maps can help if the analysis is rigorous. But how is that done? How do we then also go beyond just the strict analysis, but how do we engage people? We've done a lot of work with the First Nations, not nearly as much as Jim and Jeff, but certainly some of the more successful efforts where we were engaging them with super high resolution 3D regional landscape visualizations so that we could look through the landscape and someone could point out their fishing camp. I do not pretend to be an expert about this at all, but I do believe that there is a role for high technology in engaging with everybody, whoever they are. I mean, I used it in Kenya with coffee and coffee farmers, and to be able to capture vernacular knowledge using high technology. In that case, a compact airborne imaging spectrometer that could actually tell how the way that they configured their cropland was influencing the individual meter of maize production with a high degree of accuracy. Anyway, so we need to collaborate as well. So how do we collaborate? How do we carry it out? Like, has anybody in landscape architecture ever taken a course, and maybe they have, in how to do interdisciplinary collaborative research? You'd think that there are some tips that somebody could tell you. So I think that's an area. Like, what are the best ways to collaborate? Or what are some, maybe not the best ways, what are some successful ways? And then who, and this is a short list, but note that there's a lot of people on this. And they include developers. They include people there should be an economic development. Oh yeah, I did say that back here, because there was this last bullet here. How do we consider economic development in spatial plans? Because of all the, I like to think we have all these holistic models and we bring all to bear, an integrated planning model. But quite often what's missing, usually what's missing, is the fiscal economic business case to be made for it. And that's the one that people care about. There's two things that drive that I've found that will drive a political decision more than anything else. One is the cost of public infrastructure. You have to know that. You have to have a model, or you have to be able to assess it accurately. If you're doing growth management plans, you better have a way of collecting all that data and making that determination. And the other is water. Water quality, quantity, timing. And because those things are generally regulated, there's usually or the impacts are so catastrophic. And all the other things, sense of place and community buy-in and all of that, or improvements to the public realm, those are all, if you don't get the first two, you'll never get the other ones. You have to have those. I'm not saying they're not important, they are. And they're not just collateral benefits, they're fundamental benefits, but in terms of arguing that, you have to get that out there. So collaborative processes, lawyers is one. Again, I think, I believe in law, and that ultimately, for many things, we can volunteer all we want. We can, but some things we need to have treaties or agreements or laws, and I think we need advice on that. And we need to collaborate with those people. All of these things are all landscape issues that could be dealt with in a research network. If people shared, like our firm, the stuff that, again, that Keith is talking, the model at UBC, great model, sign me up. It's so beneficial to businesses and practitioners to be included in the loop of where research is going. We like to think we're a cutting edge firm. I think we are, but and there's lots to learn, and there's lots to collaborate on. So that is one other. Oh, the last one, this is just a plug, because there's another thing that I think is a big issue these days, and I happen to be the chair of the not-for-profit Safe Design Council, which is like CEPTED on steroids. It's a lead system. It's a lead system for safe certifying buildings and properties. And it looks at a number of things, but it's trying to reduce not only the occurrence of crime, but the fear of crime. Now, up until recently, we haven't been concentrating on counterterrorism, although we are now, particularly in the public realm, not some of the more stuff that once you're inside buildings, there's not much you can do about a terrorist. But outside, it's a really big deal. It's a landscape issue. Safety and security in the public realm is a landscape design issue. And where you have a functional design that meets other kinds of design objectives and is safe and secure, and you can't get a truck up to 30 miles an hour and so on, and you're stopping access into areas. So do we want to just line everything with bollards, or can we use our head a little bit more and have things that are, maybe they're stormwater treatment plants, traps, but they're also vehicle traps. There's all kinds of ways to approach this, and I think that's another area that would be really helpful, and that I know that the Safe Council would fund research on that. And there's a lot of it out there. So we look at a number of things. And then this is hanging on my wall at the office, and it says, it's Graham Wilson, the great cartoonist, second only to Kleban in my view as a cartoonist, that says, "You're not thinking intergalactic, Olson." And I think that that for this network that you're talking about, like, I hope you're real about it. I hope you mean it, because I think you should be able to get millions of dollars if you put it out there properly. There's so many advantages. If you're dealing with the big issues, and maybe it might be harder to argue it on some, more esoteric levels, which are also important, but maybe aren't as important to those holding the public purse. I think that if you, we're talking big issues here, flood, but also if you're going to spend billions of dollars doing these kinds of mitigation, don't we want to have other kinds of benefits flow from them? You put one kilometer of road in the wrong place and you paid for a growth management plan. So these are the kinds of arguments that I hope you'll make, but I don't think you should think small. And because, as I said yesterday, you can never go, you can never go up again. So if you start small, you'll never get more. But think big, but think realistically. Make a good argument for it. Involve practitioners, because I think some of us know how to write grant or proposals and that too. They're not the same. So these are not always the same as an academic grant proposal. And it's good to have partners. And maybe we can help identify some of the partners for you, So anyway, thank you.